Why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Europe and not others? At the time, more developed more developed civilizations like China, India, and Arabia. I'm not sure if Arabia was a developed civilization, but China and India certainly were. So, why did this industrial revolution happen in Europe, not China, not India? Hmm? See, the industrial revolution is something that happened in the mid 18th century, right? And a bunch of conditions came together to make it happen. What shaped, what caused, what precipitated the industrial revolution was a bunch of factors like abundant energy, access to big markets, uh, abundant energy, abundant resources, access to huge markets, institutions that 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 allowed the development of technology and ideas, new ideas that gave rise to the technologies, right? So a bunch of things came together, and these things did not exist in the same place at the same time in India and China, or in the Islamic world at the time. So first of all, energy, like I said, you needed access to abundant energy, which is coal. So if you look at England, for example, if you look at Belgium, even if you look at Germany, they had access to abundant coal near the industrial centers they were creating. Then they had access to resources that were coming in from overseas colonies, especially England. They would bring in resources, they would bring in materials, and then they would transform them into finished products. Then they had access to colonies. So the British, they had access to the Americas, they had access to the Caribbean. They obviously had access to India, the major crown jewel of their empire. They had access to resources that came in from Africa also, right, and various parts of Asia. So these resources all came in. These raw materials they would bring in from these parts of the world, and they would transform them into finished products. Then they had this capitalist culture, capitalist structure. They had strong financial institutions. They had legal protection for private property. They were easily able to mobilize capital through joint stock companies. They had insurance. They had legislation that was friendly to investors and entrepreneurs. So all these things made it easy to mobilize the capital you needed for factories, for infrastructure, for mines, all of that. Then one thing that you had in England and some of these countries is that you had high wages relative to the cost of energy. Okay. So energy costs whatever per unit, whatever. And compared to that, the cost of labor per unit is pretty high. And that incentivized machines that were labor saving in nature. That's why these nations produced these economically attractive labor saving machines, automation, right? Then what you had in Europe was you had many competing nations. There's political fragmentation in Europe. You don't have a single empire in Europe. You had many competing nations, many competing states. So that created the incentive in nations like England to innovate rapidly on a war footing in technology, in finance, in warfare also, right? And then you had in England the tradition of piracy. When the Americas were being taken over by the Spaniards and the English were left behind, Queen Elizabeth, she essentially supported piracy, state-sponsored piracy. So you had that. So they were very willing to cut corners and do things that were illegal as per the rules-based world order, and the objective was to win. So you had that, and you had the Elizabethan age in England. That was the precursor to the Industrial Revolution that supported science and technology, which was no longer overtly religious. And that's why you had in England things like scientific societies that came up, patent systems, universities that were increasingly open to physics, to natural philosophy, and all of this then linked the practical mechanics with theoretical science. And that gave rise to eventually the perfect conditions for creating an industrial revolution. And because the European nations were so competitive, that's why they sought to expand territories elsewhere. And that also gave rise to the era of colonization, of foreign occupation of the Americas, of Africa, of India, eventually various parts of Asia and so on. So all of these factors came together, and you do not have these factors in, let's say, China or India. All the factors at the same time in the same place. That's why you have this industrial revolution in Europe and not other places.